In this tutorial, I will explain how to program a top-down character controller for your game. Enjoy! First, make sure you get yourself some images for the player. For now, I'll use the same sprites that I used at the start of my own game. Once you have the sprites, create a folder called sprites, and in there, create a folder called player. Drag and drop the player sprites into this folder. Every time you import some sprites, you have to set the import settings. Set the sprite mode to single, the pixels per unit to 32, and filter mode to no filter. Otherwise, your sprites will get blurred. And for small images, set the maximum size to 1024. You also want to make sure to almost always set the same pixels per unit size. You can play around with this setting to see what it does. Now, in the sample scene, create a new game object called player. Right-click the object and add another game object called GFX for graphics. In this graphics game object, select add new component and type in sprite renderer. Once this has been added, select the main sprite for your player. Now you can play around with the scale settings at the top to get the dimensions right. Now that we've got the basics, go back to your assets in the folder view. In here, create a new folder called scripts and create a player folder in here as well. In this player folder, create a new C# script called player movement. Once the script is created, select the player game object and drag the script over to the component list. When the script is attached, double-click the script in the folder view to open it up in Visual Studio. I have my preferred editor set to Visual Studio Codes, but this will not affect anything. In the script, you can see two functions, start and update. The update function will be called every single frame. The start function will be called on the frame that the object is initialized. In general, there are two ways to program movement. We can adjust the position of our player directly by accessing the transform component. The second option is to use forces and physics to simulate acceleration. For a simple top-down tutorial, we can directly change the position. For platformers, the physics approach would be better. First, we'll create a float variable that will store the speed at which the player is moving. Write serialize field and make the variable private. The private makes it so only this script can access this variable. By default, any private variables will be hidden in the editor. By adding in the serialize fields, it will bypass this and show up in the editor. Now create a private void function called handle movement. In this function, we'll update the transform attached to the game object of the player, causing it to move. Unity has a function called getAccessRaw. This function essentially returns 1 and 0 or -1 depending on the direction on either the vertical or horizontal axes that the player can be moving at. This will all become clear very shortly. Inside the handle movement function, create a floating void variable called xMove and set it equal to getAccessRaw horizontal. Now do the same for the y-axis by using vertical as the argument. Next, we'll create a direction vector to tell us in what direction we should add to the position. We also want to make sure to normalize this vector. Following this, multiply this vector by the player speeds and by time.delta time. This is the elapsed time in milliseconds since the previous frame update. And we'll make sure that regardless of how many times this function is called, the player will always move at the same speed. The last thing to do is to adjust the transform of our player. By writing transform in any script, you can immediately access the transform component of the game object of the script. Write transform.position plus equals direction. Let's not forget to call the handle movement function in the update function and go back to the Unity editor. We now have a simple moving character. Next, I want to have the camera follow the player. What I'll do first is add some objects to the scene, otherwise we won't know if the camera follow is working. Once the objects have been added, create a new function inside the player movement script called handle camera follow. We can access the main camera by writing camera.main. We can just as easily access its position. To set the x and y coordinates of the camera equal to that of the player, write camera.main.transform.position equals a new vector tree, of which the x and y coordinates will be the player's position and the z coordinate will still be the camera's position. Once this has been done, make sure to call the handle camera function and go back to the editor. If everything works correctly, the camera should now be following the player. I do want to add that in a real professional environment, this wouldn't be how a camera follow is programmed. Instead, the camera would have a camera manager script that handles when and how to follow what objects. Animations in Unity will be properly explained in another video. For now, I want to change the sprite of our graphics object depending on the direction in which the player is moving. First, we'll need a reference to our graphics object. Inside our player movement script, create a serialized field private game object called GFX object. Then create a private sprite renderer called SR inside the start function and make sure to set the SR equal to GFX object.getComponent sprite renderer. Next, create a private function called updateSprite and make sure to call this function in the update function. Inside our new function, copy the xmove and ymove variables from the handle movement function. We're going to look at these variables to determine in what direction the player is facing. First, we do have to add the different possible sprites. At the top, create 4 serialized field sprites and call them player up, player left, player down, and player right. Now, if the y movement variable is greater than 0, we are moving upwards. So we'll set sr.sprite equal to player up. We'll do the same for the other directions. Now go back to Unity and drag the graphics game object in the inspector. Also go to your sprites folder and put all the correct sprites in the inspector. If we now run the game, we should see that our sprite is changing depending on the direction we are moving in. I hope this video helped you and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.